Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative. This is the second virtual town hall community conversation that's been held by the organization, and we welcome you to what we believe will be a very entertaining, informative, and insightful presentation. This evening, we've got several very distinguished panelists with us, and I will get to their names here in just one moment. Just want to mention a few items so you'll have an idea how the flow will go for this evening. We'll be on for approximately 2 hours, and we may run over just a little bit, and I'm just saying that up front because I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming in. And because we've moved from a live in-person environment where we were able to be very interactive, the virtual platform does change that just a wee bit, but we promise that we'll get to everybody as much as possible, okay? So with that, I'm just going to also let you know that for those of you who may have been asked by others about whether or not this would be available for viewing later, the answer is yes. This event tonight is being recorded and will be available on the HREI website, the public page for this organization. And we will probably try to get that into the chat room for you later. But there's a public page on the City of Hopkins website. So if you go there, you should be able to find it. So with that, I'm going to move us right along because we have a very content-rich evening ahead of us. We've got a video that we're going to be showing this evening. It's going to be something that maybe some have seen or heard about, but it's we're actually privileged and honored to have the actual filmmaker with us this evening. It's a PBS special that's I believe it has won an award. And so with that, I will just start with the introductions for our panelists this evening. So if we, all of our panelists are in the Zoom room with me, and the virtual Zoom room, I should say. The first person that I'm going to introduce is Kirsten Elverum. Kirsten is the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Hopkins. Kirsten is also an active member of the Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative and brings to us a lot of good information and insights around zoning and housing. And so she really is a key person for the City of Hopkins in helping to keep an eye on all the different movement of households, all households, okay? So that's Kirsten. We also have with us Daniel Bergen, and Daniel Bergen is the individual that I was referring to. Daniel works for TPT here in the Twin Cities, and he is also the filmmaker and the producer for this very special film. And welcome to you, Daniel, and welcome Kirsten also. Glad to have you with us. The next person, and I separated the two Kirstens because we have two this evening, but the Kirsten that I'm going to introduce now is Dr. Kirsten Delegard, who is the founder of a very significant project called Mapping Prejudice, and she's affiliated with the University of Minnesota. There's a lot more to her background and her title, but let's just say that she's somebody that has her finger on the pulse of what's been happening in terms of deconstructing systemic racism and how it actually has come about here, even in good old Minnesota. So these are our panelists. I'm actually going to now, because the video is going to run fairly long, I just want to keep things moving along. I'm going to come back to our film producer. By the way, Kirsten and Daniel, I believe, collaborated on the production of this document. So we've got star power in the house with this evening. So with that, I'm going to switch back to Daniel, the filmmaker, and I'm going to actually just ask Daniel to offer a few introductory remarks regarding the film, and before we get into it. But Daniel, if you just spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes setting this up and letting everybody know what's the context of the video and how you came about with the notion to even do this project.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks to our friends in Hopkins for convening this conversation. I'm really excited and honored to be here, and glad to have my film that I worked with Kirsten on as a part of this, as a touchstone for this important conversation. So I'm an executive producer with Twin Cities PBS in St. Paul, and for years have created work that really explores our story here in Minnesota in many ways, but often looking at our history. And that's something that I focused on in a number of productions over the years. North Star, Minnesota's Black Pioneers, even a sports history called Becoming Big League. But this documentary, Jim Crow of the North, has really become one of the most important programs we've ever produced because of its life in the community in settings like this as a touchstone for this important conversation. And it certainly was last year, as Kurt and I were involved in a lot of these screenings, but after the events of this year and the kind of heightening of the tension around racial disparities, this idea of how we got to now and looking at this hidden history of restrictive covenants buried deep in the deeds of housing in Hennepin County that led to red lines that kind of helped push further and further African Americans and other people of color into fewer and fewer spaces in the county, which has contributed greatly to the wealth and health and other inequities we see today. So I'm really proud of the film Jim Crow of the North, in large part because of the great collaboration with my team at TPT and Kirsten Delegard's team with Mapping Prejudice, but also with the community, folks who really saw this as a story that needed to be told and worked with us to do that. But this is really what we hope for with a project like this. It's fine to be on the air and to be seen by tens of thousands of people, as it has been. It's great that it won an Emmy Award for history documentary in our region, but truly, this has been really rewarding and I think important and affirming that this history can be a way for us to kind of get into these conversations about where we are now by understanding some of the past. So, often our work is focused on urban issues and the cities get a lot of focus even with my work. And then we run off to greater Minnesota to make sure we're, being fair and showing kind of that rural experience. But I feel like the suburbs are often left out in a lot of these conversations, both what works and what's effective, and also some of the struggles we've had. In a great city like Hopkins, which I know well, my daughter has a lot of friends there. We're driving in and out for different activities. Has some of the same, as we'll learn from Kirsten, has some of the same struggles in terms of this system of covenants that got into the real estate and the land and the housing as Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so that's what you're going to see in the film. If you have seen it, you can go get dinner. If you haven't, sit down, relax, and check it out. But do come back for this conversation because it always is powerful and transcends the content of the film. So I hope folks can come back and join the conversation.
Well, thank you, Daniel. The thing that I'm really excited about is you've provided us a gift, really, of information, and so it's also a gift to have you present with us and Dr. Delegard as well, you two collaborators. So with that, I'm going to just pause and any further remarks and just suggest that we get the video showing, and we'll be back with everybody after the film. We've got about 55 minutes. Thank you.
This mob of over 100 people marched on an African-American's house in October of 1909 to try to stop this family from moving in. leading men of Minneapolis, as the newspaper called them, these are not the kind of people who want to be involved in mob violence. And they don't have to, because they have other tools that they can use. And there's this tool that they become aware of. It's called a racial covenant. And so just a few months after this confrontation, you see the first racial covenant appear in a Minneapolis property.
And this is where you first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African descent.
100% that were aimed at Black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism have a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the streets, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
When you can covenant entire areas of the city, it makes it off limits. That's pretty powerful. This is Jim Crow of the North.
By the end of the century, it would seem that Minnesota was one of the most enlightened states with regard to race. You had a leadership of the state that seemed much more amenable to doing the right thing, or at least supporting in word policies that respected the dignity of the African American. Frank Wheaton came from Maryland. Wheaton came to Minnesota. He saw opportunity out here. He already had a law degree when he entered the law school at the university. And when he got out, he had aspirations for political advancement. He understood how to establish a rapport with the party apparatus. And as a result of their support, he was able to win an election in South Minneapolis with a constituency made up of white and immigrant voters. He authored 2 bits of legislation that dealt with civil rights, public accommodations. The Civil Rights Bill, the Accommodations Bill, only dealt with blacks not being discriminated against in terms of going to restaurants, hotels, riding in streetcars, the railroads, places like that. It didn't really deal with other issues like schools and housing and things of that nature. But for all intents and purposes, it was a major step forward with regard to civil rights.
In 1910, Minneapolis isn't particularly segregated. There's emerging African-American neighborhoods around Lake Harriet, around West River Road, certainly on the east side of Minneapolis.
Prospect Park is this beautiful neighborhood, very close to downtown, very close to the University of Minnesota, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. It was a very desirable neighborhood, and I think neighbors weren't surprised when they saw a house that fit into this neighborhood on what is now East Franklin Avenue.
Madison Jackson, he was a guy who had a law degree, but he was a Pullman porter. He moved his family to Prospect Park, and he built a house there. This was the first black family there.
My father had bought a piece of land in what is known as Prospect Park. Minneapolis, and he broke ground to build the house in which I grew up. Until the house was nearly completed, the completely white community did not realize that a black family was moving in. And when we moved in, the whole community became quite aroused that a black family should be moving in.
Marvel Jackson, she said, when the neighbors across the street saw who they were, she said that lady started screaming when she realized that it was an African-American family that was moving in across the street from her.
I was 7, so I remember them. Meetings on our lawn as to why we could not live there. When my father and mother wouldn't budge, they had committees come to meet them. And I remember sitting on the steps listening to some of the things that were said. For instance, one of the things, our children will not play with your children. And my father hadn't thought about the impact on the children. My father built us a playground like there was no other like it in the whole area. And we became the most popular children in the place. The neighbors couldn't keep their children away.
A little while after they moved in, the father's friend and coworker also wanted to build a house in the neighborhood.
William and Daisy Simpson, they were going to build a house as well. And they were staying in the Jackson house while their house was under construction.
And I think that was the tipping point.
And that's when the resistance from white homeowners really ramped up.
And this is where the Tribune reports a race war in Prospect Park.
This mob of over 100 people, the newspaper described it as some of the most powerful people in Minneapolis, marched on the Jackson house in October of 1909. They read prepared statements.
It was decided that a large delegation should call upon you to make doubly impressive a fact, namely, that the white residents of this district do not want members of your race domiciled in our midst. We are not here to argue, but to make a perfectly plain statement of our position in the matter, to wit, that we do not want you.
And as men of prudence, judgment, and determination, we will do everything we can to prevent this. And then there was another threat.
Rumors have been brought to our attention that there are parties in this vicinity who are determined that you and those of your race shall not reside in this district, that they have firmly declared themselves ready to take any steps necessary to bring about your removal.
And you have to understand, in 1909, this is a period where lynchings are commonplace. These were not idle threats. The amazing thing to me is that both of these families persisted. They stayed in their houses. The Simpsons built a lovely home, which is still there today. Marvel blazed a trail. She was the first African-American child to go through Pratt Elementary School. I learned that her mother had actually dated W.E.B. Du Bois before marrying Madison Jackson. That gives me clues as to what that household must have been like. As soon as they became teenagers, all those white friends she had basically abandoned her.
At that time, I determined I was going to get out of that kind of society and go where my people were.
She went to the University of Minnesota, where she dated Roy Wilkins and was engaged to him briefly. As soon as she finished at the University of Minnesota, she got out of Minneapolis.
Her parents had protected her, I think, from a lot of the racism in her childhood, but when you get to be a grown-up, you certainly can experience this more. And she realized there was really no place for her here. Well, Minneapolis's loss was the Harlem Renaissance gain.
She ended up moving to New York City. She ended up working for W.E.B. Du Bois. She ended up becoming one of the premier African-American journalists in the country. And then she became one of the first Black journalists to work for an all-white publication. So she has this incredible career, incredible talents, gifts, passion, and Minneapolis lost her. Madison Jackson died in 1927. Once he died and they sold the house, both families left Minneapolis. And I just wonder what it would have been like, if they had been welcomed. If Prospect Park had become an enclave for Black intellectuals and Black civil rights activists. What would that have been like? How would the city be different? And that's what I think about a lot when I think about this story.
The problem with the Madison Jackson and William Simpson incident is people had to show up in their front yard and threaten them. And this was in 1909. I don't think it's any coincidence that in May of 1910, the first racial covenant shows up in South Minneapolis. I'm pretty sure I know who wrote that covenant, and that was one Edmund G. Walton. He was a real estate developer. The legacy he left on Minneapolis, there's Edmund Boulevard, there's all these additions with his last name. Really, probably the most important and the worst was this legacy of racial covenants.
So when people purchase a home, traditionally you get an abstract package. And it shows every time your property, the property that you've just purchased, changed hands. And in Minneapolis, properties that were platted after 1910 are very likely to have these racial restrictions embedded in the property deed.
Covenants can be building covenants, they can be setback requirements, but the racial covenants that we're concerned with tells you who can or cannot live, lease, even occupy certain spaces.
Racially restrictive covenants, private contracts between individuals that allow them to dictate to whom they'll sell their property.
Identifying racial covenants, however, has proved remarkably challenging. The only way to find racial covenants are to read warranty deeds. We're looking at about 3 million deeds in Hennepin County between 1900 and 1960, and each deed on average runs about 3 pages. So we're in the ballpark of 10 million or so pages of text. Penny found about 4,000, 5,000 racial covenants by herself. The old-fashioned way. She just went down to the county recorder's office and started going through deeds. And she found several thousand racially restrictive covenants. And that was enough to get us thinking, okay, hey, maybe we can do more than just show that racial covenants were a practice that was used in Minneapolis. What if we can map all of them? The first map that Penny made was shocking. I was shocked when I saw this, and I was shocked when she started reading me some of the language of these racial covenants.
The wording can be very different. They're working on early 20th century ideas of race.
Chinese, Japanese, Negro, Moorish, Turkish,
Mongolian,
Hebrew, sometimes Semitic.
People of African blood or descent. No Negroes or Jews. Only Caucasians, except for their domestic servants of a different race who might be domiciled with the owner.
Many of them were written during the period where eugenics is at front and center of American scientific thought, and that language is often what you see in these deeds.
Only people of the Aryan race can inhabit this land.
Or the Aryan branch of the Caucasian race.
I think one of the surprising things that I found in this research is 100% of these covenants are aimed at African Americans.
Oh, there's that, that's black. Okay, here's the legal description.
What we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is we're using digital tools to do a lot of the heavy lifting to help us identify the deeds that do contain racially restrictive covenants.
Covenants exist across the country. People say, well, why aren't you doing this for St. Paul too? I know there are covenants in St. Paul. Their deeds are not scanned.
Which is incredibly unwieldy, right? For traditional research methods where you go down to the archive and you just start going through the material, you would need an army of undergrads and the better part of a century, and even then I'm not convinced you'd be able to get through all of them. So we use OCR to translate these digitized warranty deeds into searchable text documents. Once we have these in text document form, I can write a script that iterates through and looks for predefined racial terms. And whenever it finds a match, we flag this corresponding deed image. And once we have this into the still very large but manageable realm of, around 40,000 flagged images, we asked volunteers to help us transcribe them.
And then it says, may not be sold, mortgaged, or leased to or occupied by any person or persons other than members of the Caucasian race.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So you can go ahead and click yes.
And those answers I then export, and this actually gives me enough data to build the map.
Planning has always been intentional. Space has always been intentionally manufactured to shape and represent values. The question is whose values and for whom's benefit. And I'd argue historically, low-income folks of color in particular, and larger racial and ethnic groups more broadly, have not been at the center of the benefits of urban planning.
The covenants were first put in 1910. But at that point, developers could start buying up large sections of farmland that adjoined the city.
When a developer buys what used to be a farm on the outskirts of town, they buy it, divide it into 6 city lots, and sell the individual lots off. At that point, when they start selling off the individual lots, that's really when the racial covenants kind of injected into the property record.
So people like Samuel Thorpe Brothers, could buy this up and just plat it and lay it out as they saw fit and put in covenants. It was a very efficient way of doing this. There's this real estate convention. It's there that J.C. Nichols, who runs the country club estates in Kansas City, gets up and said, a few years ago, I was really hesitant, but now I can't sell a property without them. And Sam Thorpe was certainly there. He was a retiring president. He comes back and in August of 1912, buys up the land that will become Thorpe Brothers Nokomis Terrace. And that is the first fully covenanted edition that I know of. It talks about no colored people or other objectionable types. Mary Greer was a woman who inherited many of the Dorman Edition properties near West River Road. After 1910, she started putting in racial covenants. It will never be sold or transferred or leased or conveyed to anyone who's a Negro. And that goes for people who are living with Negroes or married to Negroes. She adopted that early on. Her first one shows up about 1911 or 12. And you see this all through the teens and 20s with her. And Edmund Walton did the same thing along West River Road. At one point, I think they said he had bought up 437 acres along the river. He had gone in 1910 from sort of surreptitiously putting these covenants in, not recording them. Less than a decade later, he was bragging about them in the newspaper. There was an ad, and he printed the covenant, which shows you how quickly they were accepted.
The Supreme Court even held that restrictive covenants were constitutional. This was in the case of Corrigan v. Buckley. And it was in that decision where the court resolved that restrictive covenants are contracts, and as such, they are lawful. Now, forget about the fact that they discriminate, and forget about the fact that once we say these contracts exist, we are bringing up a violation issue of the 14th Amendment. Forget about that. The key thing is that the Supreme Court validated segregation, validated discrimination.
You have the full force of the law, the court system, determining who could go where.
And what will happen as a result of that is you'll see efforts to ensure that a denial to one of the most basic foundations of opportunity for African Americans will be codified in the United States as a result.
You had not only the courts supporting it, but also a kind of license of sorts of people going to the streets and harassing blacks who moved into white neighborhoods. The white neighbors, knowing that the Francis couple was moving in, offered them money to not move into the house. William Francis and his wife Nellie, who is one of my heroes, rejected that and moved in, and as a result faced all kinds of harassment. The Francis family did not live there for very long because shortly after moving in, William T. Francis was appointed to be the consul to Liberia, in effect an ambassador, and so they moved to Africa. It's an example of how even the most prominent of African Americans in Minnesota at the time, who had established contacts with some of the most powerful people in American politics, Nellie herself had personal audiences with Andrew Carnegie and 3 U.S. presidents, that despite their successes and their influence, could still be exposed to racial animus. So it shows the intensity of property values, the perception of property values and race.
So what racial covenants did is they hardened boundaries. They hardened these invisible racial boundaries.
It's interesting because even in neighborhoods where there maybe aren't any covenants, just being in proximity to covenants is really powerful for keeping that neighborhood white still.
Homes are often taken for granted for some of us. Instances like the Lee family faced makes us realize that a home is a kind of fragile thing. It's a 1.5 story, quite modest bungalow. You wouldn't particularly notice it, but when you know anything about its history and the story of the Lee family, it becomes quite powerful.
Arthur Lee was a World War I vet. He worked for the post office.
He had a good, steady paycheck at a time when 30% of the city is out of work. So he finds this house that someone is willing to sell him on 46th and Columbus.
It was not covenanted.
They had the temerity to violate what is at that point this boundary in the urban landscape. So Arthur Lee, he moves into the house. First the neighborhood association gets together and they try to buy him out. They contact the bank, they contact different lawyers, they try legal means. In July of 1931, by newspaper reports, 5,000 or 6,000 white people at any given time are milling around his house, trying to drive him out.
Black paint was thrown on their house.
Their dog is poisoned.
Vandalism, intimidation.
The family has to sleep in the basement. They had the sense that they had set these boundaries, that no one was to violate them.
This is just another tool, so to speak, this citizen terrorism.
And in this particular case, Arthur, who was a World War I vet, right, comes home to believe that his service to our country gave him the same access as his white counterparts, but learned very quickly that that was not the case.
It was really important for families like the Lee family to have advocates to help them fight. Being able to have lawyers like Lena Olive Smith and being able to have the NAACP on their side was really powerful in making sure that their voices were heard. The NAACP was definitely fighting against these racial covenants and these instances of racial housing discrimination. There's also smaller clubs and organizations that were really focused on fighting this. Unfortunately, even with all of these legal protections and organizations fighting for them, a lot of people don't end up getting the end result that they want.
Edith and Arthur Lee and their daughter Mary, they stayed for 2 years. They didn't make it longer than 2 years. I think the pressure was just too great for them.
I can only imagine, as a parent, as someone who wants to ensure that I'm living my values, like what it would mean to put my family at risk, what it would mean to always feel like I'm looking over my shoulder just to protect my right.
You have this escalation of this sense of threat thanks to racial covenants. So it's that intensification, that normalization of these racist ideas that leads to the Lee House.
The marker at the corner of the property has a depiction, an image of Arthur Lee. For those who just walk by, I think it gets them thinking about it.
Homeownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens on a monthly payment.
In the midst of the New Deal, when the FDR administration is looking for ways to try to stabilize the housing market, the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1934. And as part of that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is also established with the hope that if you could establish long-term mortgages with fixed interest rates, you could create pathways to homeownership for most Americans.
This time they can buy this house with monthly payments that are less than they now spend for rent.
When the FHA starts underwriting mortgages in the 1930s, this really is a game changer in a lot of ways. It takes a lot of risk off the banks, it places it onto the federal government, and now working class, middle class families, they're able to purchase a home.
Unfortunately, as part of that, what the HOLC does is it establishes designations for neighborhoods based on the occupants of those neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
There are no firm realities behind the close proximity to blackness and your property values going down. That's just not true.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they're linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African-American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
The area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area, it had nice homes. It's the historic African-American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative. And I think it does speak to the ways that white supremacy have been embedded in really built structures and built environments. I mean, if your grandparents bought a home on Minnehaha Creek, that home's worth, what, $500,000? If your grandparents rented an area that was redlined and then subsequently destroyed by a freeway project, you're not inheriting anything.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanction, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices if you want to have a really high rating from us, if you want to get the most favorable terms for any loans.
By kind of de-integrating Minneapolis, which in many ways is what racial covenants are doing, this set the stage and enabled all these subsequent systems of inequality to really take hold.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
Many whites simply were not aware that there was a segregation. So many people in Minneapolis would be outraged what they thought that their friend was being discriminated against. They knew something was happening, but it wasn't happening to your friend. That was what kind of this mixed kind of a situation that we had in Minneapolis. I mean, if you could imagine these people, their parents sent me cookies and, cakes all during the war. And I was welcome in their house. There was no question about it. And then there's other people who were just absolutely Klansmen. That was what Minneapolis was all about. But that was my generation in Minneapolis. We were hemmed in that ghetto, and that was our life. That was our world.
The 1935 land use planning map used to define which place would get mortgages versus others circled these areas, called them slums, places where the quote-unquote Negroes lived. These are places to avoid, right? So they're gonna give you substandard housing and they're gonna contain you. Access to affordable housing was a challenge. When you think about the reasons behind the creation of public housing, we had a lot of folks forced to the low-wage sector, right? And you're thinking about what jobs or opportunities that low-income folks of color even had access to at this time. I would argue that with the creation of public housing in 1938 with the Sumner Field homes became this really interesting iteration of the redesign of space. You have 400 units of public housing, which were segregated at the time, created. In 1953, the City Council of Minneapolis refused to scatter another 1,000 units of public housing outside of the Sumner Field homes area. And where did these pressures come from? You had both internal conservative politicians and outlying suburban communities coming in saying, not in my neighborhood. And the City Council crumbled under the pressure and then took what was 400 units of public housing to over 1,000 units in less than a decade. They have strategically manufactured urban poverty.
This history is very personal for me. I'm a third-generation Minneapolitan. My grandparents were immigrants from Sweden who came to this country with nothing, worked incredibly hard jobs, but both sets of my grandparents in 1942 were able to buy houses in South Minneapolis. These houses were in a part of the city that was blanketed by racial covenants. Because of those racial covenants, my parents grew up in neighborhoods that were entirely white. And in many ways, they described them as a paradise for children. They had wonderful parks. They had really solid schools that sent them to college. But no one in their neighborhood ever talked about the fact that this neighborhood was only for white people. And I want everyone with this map to imagine themselves in this landscape of privilege and disenfranchisement.
The Justice Department contended that restrictive covenants among private citizens bar Negroes and other minority groups from residential areas and are not enforceable by the courts. Their joint brief described the covenants as an artificial quarantine of minority groups.
Covenants were one of the big issues that the NAACP was tackling in the first half of the 20th century.
Thurgood Marshall was leader of the litigation part of the NAACP. When Thurgood was asked upon his retirement what was the most important case, everyone assumed he would say Brown versus Board of Education. He said, no, it was Shelley v. Kramer.
Shelley v. Kramer in the late 1940s was one of the more seminal civil rights cases that ever made it to the Supreme Court. It didn't explicitly end racial covenants as a practice, but it was a pretty big blow.
There could be no enforcement of restrictive covenants. So you could still write a restrictive covenant, but a person who signed it could breach the contract and sell it to a black person, and they would not be held liable.
It wasn't as effective as a lot of folks hoped. What people started doing is, instead of suing for breach of contract, they would sue for damages. So if somebody sells a covenanted home to an African American, the neighbors can sue that person because their property values are now lower.
Well, is there anything the matter? There's never going to be any violence in this part of town. We're peaceful people. You've got friends here. I'm your friend. We just want to know what it is you think you're doing to us.
If I have a covenanted home and I sell it to somebody who isn't white and I get sued, I lose the house. Any equity I've accumulated, the property reverts to the initial granting party, so whoever first put that covenant on the land. If that person's dead, I would revert to the heirs or assigns of the initial covenanting party. So the risk of going against these things is just like astronomical.
The restrictive covenants have already laid the foundation for a continued denial of equality for African Americans by virtue of these private contracts, which the Supreme Court will determine in 1948 are judicially unenforceable, but still legal. In fact, it plays out in a very powerful way in Lorraine Hansberry's play, A Raisin in the Sun.
You know that money we got in the mail this morning?
Yes, sir.
But what do you think your grandmama done went and done?
I don't know, Grandma.
She went and she bought you a house.
As that play was being produced, you have situations across the country, including one in Delaware, where a family in Collins Park are forced out of their home by a mob, and then ultimately the home is bombed. But what Lorraine Hansberry captures in there, in that wonderful passage where Walter Younger is kind of laying out what the foundations for freedom and equality will be for his family, and it's home ownership. One day, son, we're going to sit down and we're going to see all the great schools in America. But the pathway to that is the ownership of a home. And Lorraine Hansberry hit on something very powerful in A Raisin in the Sun, because it's playing out about this family seeking home ownership as a pathway to true freedom and true equality.
And there is no one factor more representative of or more conducive to the economic well-being of the American citizen than the home in which he lives.
The spread of covenants in the first half of the 20th century is pretty much the same story as the spread of the Twin Cities over the first half of the 20th century. The first-ring suburbs, Edina, St. Louis Park, Richfield, Bloomington, are all blanketed in racial covenants. They probably have a higher density of restrictions than Minneapolis does, simply because there was more development happening in Bloomington around 1950 than in Minneapolis. And the effects of that aren't very surprising, right? Like, that ring is very white, and this pushes African Americans into kind of the center of Minneapolis.
It denies them access to those mortgages. It denies them the opportunity to sell their homes. And in that sense, it closes off an opportunity to escape those communities, but more importantly, denies them the same pathway to the acquisition of wealth, home ownership, and then of course the sale of those properties and bequeathing those properties to their children.
My dad, Tilson would have open houses on, I think it was on 41st and 4th was the model home. It was something to behold, because as a kid, you don't really understand what this desegregation meant or what segregation really meant and redlining. You didn't really know, but you saw people come in who knew what that meant.
And in fact, I think the spokesman billed the Tilson Built Homes as possibly the first open housing event in the nation. So it was one of the first times African Americans could buy new homes on the quote-unquote open market.
I know.
It's a huge piece of housing history. For the construction for the Tilson Built Homes, that your dad demanded that there be African American men working on those jobs.
He knew what that economic power could be, what that job power could be. And he did insist on his contractors bringing people of color to the job. And it was extremely, extremely important to him. And I think the fact that it started here, again, is something unique about Minnesota.
At the same time, the disparities that we have now don't support that it was continued.
No, it didn't carry out throughout the whole community, that's for sure. The city, yeah.
Right.
It wasn't citywide. And so there is some significant divide that still lasts.
We moved to Minnesota. So that was 1956. I felt we were very fortunate to meet the people we met, a wonderful community of Black activists and others. So I became involved in the League of Women Voters, in ACP. We were very much involved in issues dealing with employment opportunities, education for our children, housing discrimination.
If you are wondering what the Fair Housing March is all about, we are attempting to get a fair housing bill passed in the state of Minnesota now. I was wondering if you would contribute something to the Fair Housing March. Sure will. Thank you very much.
There was the sense that what we needed to do was to really create a lobbying effort at the legislature in the '61 session to get fair housing introduced and passed in that session. So I was encouraged to be the chief lobbyist for that, and I invited my friend Matthew Little, Zetta Fader, and my friend Katie McWatt.
We would feel that to deny some parts of the housing market the effect of the law is fraudulent, in effect.
Those who own property have a right to sell and a right to rent, to whom we plead. And the white people, the white race, had better wake up and see the handwriting on the wall before it is too late.
To see that America, that part of America, St. Paul, become more truly what we call the American dream. It's going to be hard. It's going to cost money. You have made this mistake, your forefathers have made this mistake, and it cannot be remedied without a lot of pain and suffering and the expenditure of hard, cold cash.
I felt we were losing the vote, and so I went to Governor Elmer Anderson. He was a very open, fair, liberal Republican, one I knew and had a lot of respect for. So I went to the governor and I said, Governor, the housing bill is going to be defeated in the Judiciary Committee, and I'm very worried. And he went to his desk and wrote a note to each member of the Judiciary Committee, urging them to allow the bill to get out of the committee, that it was only fair and just in his judgment, and allow it then to be treated in the full Senate. And the bill passed by one vote. So it then got to the full Senate, where it passed, but again, narrowly. So that's back in '62, that Minnesota was one of the first states to pass a fair housing.
Whereas Minnesota's Fair Housing Act becomes operative, an implementation of the law must come from the willingness of all of our citizens to cooperate for their common protection, as well as the belief that discrimination practiced against any individual is a threat to all. Now, therefore, I, Elmer L. Anderson, Governor of the state of Minnesota, do hereby proclaim Saturday, December 29th and Sunday, December 30th as Fair Housing Sabbath in Minnesota.
So between 62 and 67, I've been very troubled because there was still so much discrimination in housing.
This week's program deals with the proposed Fair Housing Bill to prohibit discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. Senator Mondale is chief author of the bill in the Senate.
This is not an anti-riot bill, but at the same time, I think we have to be wise enough and mature enough to realize that these riots tell us something about the deep and abiding frustrations and sense of rage that exists in our American ghettos. There are compelling problems of injustice and unfairness in employment and housing and education and many other areas that we should have taken care of a long time ago.
Fair Housing Act makes it illegal to discriminate based on race, age, later they add sex and disability and etc. to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing where they so choose. And I think that has opened up doors for a lot of families. What happened to the Black middle class, for instance? Many folks were able to break into neighborhoods that they weren't, didn't have access to before. And we should have those choices. But when you don't have the economic mobility to make those choices, fair housing doesn't look very fair.
W, I-94, expand Hiawatha, expand Olson Memorial. These were all explicitly and very intentionally run through these Black communities that emerged as a result of this kind of cordon of covenants that had taken place around the city.
35W going south, it was a dividing line between the folks on the other side of the freeway and the folks on our side of the freeway. It's interesting it brought people together in one sense, and we were able to create our own community around 38th Street and 4th Avenue.
My dad and their family are originally from the Central neighborhood, and then he went to Central High School. And they tell me these stories just about what they called kind of the Black Mecca in the Central neighborhoods. When you talk about the problem, we're talking about it from a deficits-based language. I also want to make sure we're talking about an asset-based language. I think we need to be aware of this kind of assault on the character of these places and take back that narrative in intentional ways.
We're not going to be able to get everybody out of the discriminated areas because many of them are in the center of our cities, and many of these people want to live there, and they want this opportunity for home ownership. And the only way we can do it is by partnership between private industry and the lending business and our government.
Our community was redlined, simple as that. Now, as a community, we made the best of it, and we produced a great many influential people as well. And a lot of that came from having developed a pretty powerful community. When Central High School was shut down, it took the heart and the soul out of this community. And I remember them talking about 4th Avenue and how it was now referred to as Crack Avenue, which talks about the decline in the economy in this neighborhood. But up and down 4th Avenue throughout the neighborhood, there were tough times.
So even though covenants are now illegal, kind of this, yawning chasm of wealth inequality that emerged as a result of covenants is still very much with us today. About 75% of white families in Minneapolis own the homes that they occupy. About 25% of black families in Minneapolis own the homes that they occupy. It's actually the largest, in terms of percentage, gap in the country. And this has huge implications for the racial wealth gap.
We look at where our high-income communities live, where now there has been an investment in home ownership for certain communities versus others, where if black folks were able to have participated in that during the rise and proliferation of racial covenants, you might see a different notion of black wealth. We have to first acknowledge that history and understand how we're implicated in it to then get to reparative solutions.
You do have a covenant, but it's...
Mapping Prejudice Project is doing something unlike anything seen across the country, which I think is amazing. So they're mapping the history of housing discrimination. They're naming something that has been allowed to exist in the shadows of neighborhood planning and politics.
The whole point of this map is to get people to read these racial covenants, to get people to read these racially restrictive deeds. So from the beginning, I wanted to invite as many people as possible into that process.
A lot of it was in the 50s. I think it's fascinating to see. There's a genuine curiosity about something that lay hidden for so long and buried.
And I think doing it is kind of a way to kind of get in touch with history and better understand how things are the way they are now, and see the direct connection in systemic racist language that is very much part of our history and is very much part of our present reality.
With the exhibit Owning Up to Racism in Housing in Minneapolis, we're hoping to illustrate the history of housing discrimination and racism and the impact that that had on real families. We really want to confront visitors with these histories to really take action, take responsibility, and to try to help create change in some way.
And you're done at that point with that particular deed. As it turns out, a lot of university professors are incorporating this into their curriculum. And you've got another one. Once you see that in a deed, you think, okay, this is one, but there's thousands out there. This has been an amazing experience, I think, for everyone involved. I mean, it's been amazing to me to see the goodwill and the energy that people have given us, which has been a huge gift. But I've also talked to people, and I've actually collected some data on what people say their experience has been. You know, these are mostly white people, and they have reported that the experience of reading these deeds has been transformative for them.
Their work is a graphic example of this otherwise invisible practice of discrimination.
Ideally, what we're looking at is changing the grand narrative away from personal pathology, cultures of poverty, as the saying goes, to saying, you know, the system was rigged from the get-go. This is how it happened.
So, at the last moment, city planners decided to reroute the freeway several blocks east, right through a black neighborhood. Racial covenants show us how structural...
We're showing how incredibly central racial covenants were in terms of laying the groundwork and the foundation for those later manifestations of racism. We are inviting people not just to know about this, but also to take action.
And what we're attempting to do is to build the first comprehensive spatial database, or map, if you will, of racial covenants for any city in the country. So there has been some... I mean, this just gives you a level of precision in data that nobody's really had access to previously. And when used in conjunction with redlining, I think it can make very powerful arguments about which areas the city need to be systematically reinvested in.
So it's real important to speak about the history of the community and figure out what made it click. Yesterday, and implementing some of those same approaches tomorrow. And I see pieces of that kind of development of the community starting to surface.
Talk about space and urban planning, we're talking more than like bricks and mortars and like windows. We are talking about people's lives, their values, and their humanity.
Wow, what a documentary. Daniel, thank you so much, and same to you, Dr. Delegard. I just realized something in my haste to get the evening program started. I forgot to even identify who I am. Let me just take a brief moment just to step back. My name is Bill Wells, and I'm a diversity consultant. I've been working with the Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative since it first began. It's been a little over 5 years now. So the primary purpose for the initiative is to address racial awareness and understanding. And so we've been on a long continuum of learning workshops that I've helped to conduct. And we've also had a series of ongoing community conversations, which hopefully a number of the people that are with us this evening have been attending. So I just wanted to put that in there. I'm actually going to ask both Daniel and Dr. Delegard to just comment a bit on the construction of the video that was put together. I've seen it now probably 3 or 4 times, and every time I see it, it just hits me the same way. And the irony of what I heard earlier this morning on CBS Morning News, and I don't know if anybody else heard it, Minnesota was voted as the 3rd happiest state in the country. And you know, I saw that's the news that I started with this morning, and now I'm watching this film. And there's a question that came in from the audience, and I forwarded it to both you, Daniel, and Dr. Delegard. So it's really kind of an ironic twist to today for me. So anyway, let's hear from our experts. So Daniel.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks everybody for watching and then sticking around for this conversation. I'm looking forward to this. You know, it is difficult history, and that's something that's really important, I think, for PBS to help us understand. You know, maybe using the unique powers of cinema and the immersive experience of film helps us, you know, certainly feel some of that, the struggle, but also, you know, kind of feel the balm, if there is any, of the hope, the resistance, the strength of communities in spite of all of these systemic and structural racist facets that are so impacting our community. So those are some of the things we wanted to bring into the film. You know, again, the idea is what next? And so that's why I love that you're using this so that we can do just that and have that conversation of what next. But of course, we couldn't have made this film if it wasn't for the singular research project that was Mapping Prejudice. You know, I've done many history documentaries, done a lot of research myself, you know, built it from the ground up. But in this case, as you heard in the film, it would have been impossible to do the film, nearly impossible to do this research if not for the kind of unique approaches and ultimately the community rootedness of the Mapping Prejudice team. So it was kind of easy for me, Bill.
Okay. Okay. Well, good. That's a good segue, I think, to bring Dr. Delegard into this. And Kirsten, join us in the conversation and tell us about your collaboration on this project. And let's tell us a bit more about the mapping prejudice. I mean, it was evident in the video, but nothing like having it come from the live source. So, Dr. Delegard.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And I want to echo Dan's sentiments. Thanks for sticking around tonight and watching the film on what may be one of our last beautiful nights of the year before we head into winter, right? So the idea that Dan said that his job was easy with this film is just, it's frankly laughable to me. But this was one of the most satisfying collaborations, of course, of my whole career, not only with my own team of collaborators where we really bring together complementary skills to do this work, but also with Dan, because I spent all this time in the archives digging up the stories of the Jacksons and the Lees, and Dan wove them into this beautiful story, right? Which he then integrated with the whole history of the Old South Side. And we were, Bill and Dan and I were exchanging messages while you all were watching the film about the Old South Side. And it is one of, I feel like one of the forgotten treasures of Minneapolis that I grew up as a Minneapolitan, and the area around 4th Avenue South and 38th Street, where Sabathani Community Center is now, is one of the only extant African-American neighborhoods, that was not totally demolished by urban renewal or highway construction in the Twin Cities. And I hope one of the things that this documentary brings is more attention to the rich cultural history of this really important place. So yes, I just want to echo again, Mapping Prejudice. Our goal is to illuminate the structural racism that's so pronounced in Minneapolis. That has, of course, brought us to the place that we are today with the highest racial disparities in the country. Brought us to the place where we actually were at the epicenter of what is now the largest protest movement in American history. The 25 million Americans who've taken to the streets in support of Black Lives Matter since the death of George Floyd. I mean, this is all this history is what got us to the place that we are today. But it's my hope that the map that we have created with the community and this film can bring us together around a shared history of how we have been so divided, right? So with that, I guess I'm going to open up to questions and see where this discussion.
Okay, good. Well, I do have a question. I've got several questions that are coming in from the audience, so that's good. A question, and you were actually addressing that. The question is, was the breakup of Central High School an attempt to break up the African American community?
Yeah, I feel like that's outside of my wheelhouse. I mean, I think the testimony from the people in the neighborhood is that it was devastating. I do not believe that Dr. Richard Green ever would have intended to break up the Black community. So the Green family, of course, is so invested in that neighborhood. So I don't know, Daniel, do you have any insights on that?
Just to reiterate what you just described, that clearly, how intended it was for nefarious purposes, which you're right. I knew Dr. Green as a teenager. I actually spoke protesting at the school board, and he was very intimidating, but afterwards he came up and said, "Good job, young man." He was really an amazing leader. But the fact of the matter is that losing Warrington Elementary School and then Bryant Junior High, which is now Sabathani, and then Central, had forever, and Bill, you can speak to this, forever changed the neighborhood. And as Kirsten said, if you talk to elders, that's the first thing they'll talk about, maybe even before the freeway. Of course, 35W contributed to the kind of decline in the neighborhood generally, people leaving, Black and white, that lowered the student body population, and all those things contribute to the closing of a historic school. But that's the important point. I'm glad the viewer kind of focused on that, is that, you know, those schools were key to the neighborhood in relation with the business district that Kirsten was describing at 38th Street and 4th Avenue, historic district, vital and lively fulcrum of Black business and culture. And just to hear elders talk about, you know, on a Friday afternoon, kind of being at that intersection, or before a Central football game, you know, the barbers kind of heading down from the barbershop to watch a game, you really get a sense of the power in that community, and then a sense of the loss that the viewer is describing, and that Central is certainly a part of that.
Well, it's very interesting because that entire corridor, not the entire corridor, but it has changed a lot. And as you will see, and you go further down, like around 41st Street, off a block or so away from 4th Avenue, it's been gentrified. I mean, the community is turning. It's not an African American community anymore. It's younger couples that don't look like the community used to look. So there is a change. There is a significant change. I think we've got some other questions that are coming in. The question is, who are the happy people interviewed in the poll that was mentioned? That's a good point. I'm not sure I can answer that, but there were several. People would have to go back to the poll. I picked it up this morning. I think New Jersey was number 4, and there were some real questions about the audience, and I think Maryland was number 5. I forgot who was number 1 and number 2. But anyway, that's a good question. I think that deserves some research.
Can I speak to this? Because I do.
Absolutely.
I think it's a perfect framing, actually, for this history, which is the narratives that have sort of animated our sense of civic, our civic reputation or civic culture, have been that Minneapolis, the Twin Cities in particular, are these exceptional places where life is really great for people. And those stories, you know, while they reflect assets in the community, great things about this community, they also completely obscure these disparities. The fact that the people benefiting from all these resources that are usually touted, whether it's the arts, the schools, the green spaces, are largely white people, right? And so, you know, so part of the question that drove my interrogation of these racial covenants in the first place was to try to use history to disrupt that narrative and it's not that I don't want people in Minnesota to be happy, of course, but it just seems like the question is who's happy, right? And how do you define that? And people have been really perfectly content to say, okay, well, that's like the important story. And the people who are unhappy, the people who are suffering, the people who are struggling, that's just peripheral to the real story of Minnesota. And I hope that events, you know, the death of George Floyd and the events of the spring and summer have really busted that myth forever.
Yeah, Bill, if I could also, because I do think that's appropriate framing, and I see some of our viewers are kind of describing, you know, that a little more of a lighter touch and not really social science. So I appreciate that feedback. But, you know, I would like folks, especially those of folks in the West Metro, you know, to think about this scholarly term that, you know, really is a good way to think about this history, this idea of the Minnesota paradox, you know, that, and that's in a way what this poll is suggesting too, that, you know, in the case of social justice and civil rights, Minnesota does have a record of being, you know, at the vanguard politically, in some ways, you know, in terms of the faith community. And that goes back to the very founding of the state, a real abolitionist kind of hotbed in one way. But at the same time, across the river in St. Paul, a lot of slave supporting businessmen who wanted that kind of business from the South. So, so that idea of the Minnesota paradox is one that you see in this film and in the Mapping Prejudice research in high relief of who benefits and who doesn't. You know, and I think when I think about a great town like Hopkins, you probably could see it there as well, where you've got some of the best education in the state, but then you probably are, and you are kind of seeing some of the struggles too of a real and living community and a diverse community. So that idea of Minnesota is very paradoxical, and it, as Kirsten said, it's both things. They both can coexist. But the problem is when the narrative is just about the happiest, most progressive, good life in Minnesota, Wendell Anderson holding the fish on Time magazine. That's the problem. Because at that very same time, he was holding the fish in the early 70s on the Time magazine, which I love. Such a dope Minnesota icon. But, you know, we were at the, you know, kind of bottom of all of the effects of the restrictive covenants, the red lines, you know, the kind of success, but a lot of the failures of civil rights, and that wasn't the good life at that point, and still isn't now, clearly.
Can I a cautionary tale on this score, that because this is something that you can tell I feel very strongly about. So when you look back through the history of the Twin Cities over the last 100 years, you see these moments, these inflection points where people come together around this this awareness that things maybe aren't all that great for everybody in the Twin Cities. So another really important moment like this was right after World War II, when Minneapolis in particular was really renowned across the country for being intolerant, in large part because of the treatment of Jews, but also because of so there were a lot of Japanese Americans who were relocated here during World War II. They also faced a lot of struggles, and Black people. And so Hubert Humphrey actually brought this team of Black sociologists from Fisk University to do this famous social experiment in Minneapolis, where they recruited thousands of volunteers to examine the racial attitudes of Minneapolitans. And this got Minneapolis on the map as being this like citadel of civil rights. Those were the headlines, right? And it got all this national press from being for making this amazing transformation from being this incredibly intolerant place to being one of the most tolerant places in the country. So when you look at those reports, it's all about like your personal feelings about race. And they mention sort of in passing these racial covenants, like, yeah, 40% of the city is covered by these racial covenants, but, you know, as though that's irrelevant. So I guess I think it's so important for us, if we're thinking about action steps, to be thinking about at this moment of time, which I feel like is another really important inflection point for our community, not just for for Hopkins, for the whole metropolitan area. What are the material steps that we can take actually to address these long-standing disparities and inequities?
Yeah, very good. Okay, so there are several other questions that have been coming in, and actually some of them are actually directed specifically at Hopkins. So I think that would be an appropriate time. I'm looking at our the time of the event, and I believe if we keep this moving, we'll be able to cover everything and get all the questions responded to. So at this time, I'm going to actually bring the other Kirsten in, Kirsten Elverum, who's the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Hopkins. And I'm going to ask you to, Kirsten, are you there? You with us?
I am here.
Okay, very good. Good to have you with us this evening. And I know you've got some interesting information to share with us as well. So why don't you just give a little backdrop as to what you do in the City of Hopkins and how you have actually been researching some of the very same sorts of things that Daniel and Dr. Delegard have revealed to us this evening.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm really excited for this opportunity. I would start by saying, we're going to go from a stunning documentary to a handful of PowerPoint slides. So hopefully you can stick with me, even though the visuals aren't going to be quite as strong. From my perspective, I'm not an expert on redlining. I'm not an expert on racial covenants. And so questions about those things in Hopkins probably will be best answered by Dr. Delegard and Daniel. I'm going to try to take us from that point to where we are today and talk a little bit about the current lay of the land in Hopkins and what it looks like today. So I'm going to start by sharing a PowerPoint. Hopefully I can get this up for you all. Oh, wrong one.
Just goes, yep.
I'm almost there.
Slideshow right there.
Awesome. Thank you. That was my first time sharing a screen. So I can say I've done that now.
Great job.
Again, thank you for this opportunity. I am Kirsten Elverum. I'm the Director of Planning with the City of Hopkins. I've actually worked for the city for quite some time, and I must say I love this city. I'm super passionate about it. I think it's amazing in so many, many ways. But what I'm going to share with you tonight really isn't all that flattering. But I would say that it's not in any way unique to Hopkins. I think it's really a reflection of our region and our state and how redlining and covenants are part of the foundation that has really led to continued segregation and homeownership disparities by race. So this is a map that I just grabbed off of the documentary. It shows how Hopkins does have racial covenants in place. They started to appear, I believe, around the 40s and the 50s. And it's not as prevalent as some of the surrounding communities that are first ring suburbs of the Twin Cities, but they certainly still exist. This is an example of a racial covenant that was recorded against a property in central Hopkins. There are similar deed restrictions that appear in other neighborhoods, including Knollwood and Interlaken. And they show up in easements, but they're also embedded into other recorded documents like easements and other legal documents. But I am now going to fast forward to today and talk a little bit about our current situation. So you might know that Minnesota does have one of the highest homeownership rates in the country, but as the documentary pointed out, there is a huge gap between white homeowners and people of color. And that disparity is pretty significant in Minneapolis. Certainly, we rank among the top cities as far as that racial disparity homeownership gap goes. We have this chart that shows the top 25 largest metro areas, and Minneapolis having the biggest gap. The documentary also used data from the Washington Post or another study that showed that roughly 1/4 of Black families in Minneapolis own their home, which is the lowest Black homeownership rates in the United States. But white families have the highest homeownership rate at 76%. And so that gap of 50 points is really significant. These studies look at major metropolitan areas, not necessarily cities of Hopkins size, but we did a little bit of number crunching and found that our gap is slightly lower than Minneapolis. It's at 34%, but that is somewhat skewed by a high percent of rental housing that we have in Hopkins. So this chart shows that the percent of white people and Black people renting in Hopkins is very much in line with the overall population. But while white people make up 57% of the total population of Hopkins, they make up 91% of the homeowners. Black people comprise 21% of our overall population, but only 4% are homeowners. This is another way to look at homeownership by race in Hopkins, is where Black homeowners live. You know, we like to think generally of Hopkins as a very diverse community where we all get along, but really we tend to be living in very separate, racially divided neighborhoods. And Black homeowners mostly live in areas of concentrated poverty in Hopkins. Even in these neighborhoods, buying a home in Hopkins, especially your first home, is becoming more and more out of reach. And our land prices are the fact that we're a fully built out community does not really allow for new single family home construction. So opportunities for people of color to live in Hopkins often is through rental housing. Hopkins is an extremely unique community in many ways, but one of our biggest distinctions is that high percent of rental property. Hopkins has about 65% rental housing versus 35% owner occupied. That is roughly opposite of what most cities mix is. So over the years, I've heard many comments like this one that we recently received when we were seeking feedback on a development project. But I really think stereotypes are dangerous. I think that in Hopkins, we have to look at our actual experience with renters. And yeah, statistics will show renters generally stay in a community on average about 3 years, whereas homeowners have a longer tenancy of around 10. But 62% of the renters in Hopkins have lived there in Hopkins for 4 years or longer. And anecdotally, I know of many renters who have lived in Hopkins for a very long time. They participate in the city. We have many that have volunteered for boards and commissions within the city. You know, renters have children in the school district and they participate in their children's lives and their sports, and they volunteer in our community. And I think we do a disservice when we discount their contributions. Homeownership is unobtainable for a lot of families of color. As I mentioned, our housing prices are escalating at a pretty rapid rate. But these families, you know, want a place where their education is really great for their children. They want the conveniences that Hopkins has. They want that hometown feel that we're so known for, and the diversity that we're able to bring. But at times, I think we're reluctant to share in that by creating new affordable rental opportunities in the city. And this is not a trend that is unique to Hopkins. We're really seeing this trend of baby boomers fighting development projects if they're not single family homes that look like theirs. We really see that they may think of themselves as being progressive. They may even be people that are considering themselves affordable housing advocates. But if a proposal comes before them that has affordable housing in their neighborhood, we often see intense organized pushback against that. This is a list of some of the arguments and statements that we have heard during the past 2 public meetings on proposed affordable housing developments. You'll find the same or similar arguments being made in opposition to proposed housing developments in surrounding cities like Eden Prairie and Minnetonka. Generally, the big 3 are that the project is too tall, it doesn't have enough parking, or that the traffic generated is just going to overpower the neighborhood. And on the surface, I think some of these things seem like reasonable ideas. But when you think about the importance of families having safe, secure, affordable housing and the instability that exists when they don't, fear of parking in the street doesn't seem to me like a good reason to pass on an opportunity to create affordable housing. And, you know, I get it. People don't want to live in their home shadowed by a large, massive building. But the reality is that's really not the case. And when we've tried to engage around design and setbacks and share the results of things like shadow studies, people really aren't interested in helping us get to a best design. They typically are focused on killing the project, period. And the fact is they have a lot of power and they have a lot of say over what is built. And the result often is continued segregation. White single-family neighborhoods stay white. I finally just want to touch on what I see as white flight in the schools. I am not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but I am a parent in the Hopkins School District, and I have seen this play out over the past 10 years. This is a quote that I pulled out of the Star Tribune article about open enrollment. And I think there's just a lot to unpack here. There's, you know, some classism. I think there's a feeling of scarcity of resources and the need to protect my family. But I think racism is also a part of this equation. And I think there are stereotypes linking income with intelligence that I think is really dangerous. So while it's not explicit like covenants, white flight to districts like Minnetonka is fear-based. I think it's fear that low income or Black families will drag down white upper income families. And somehow the diversity that really adds to an education, the ability to get to know people who aren't just like you, really isn't valued in this conversation. I must say the Hopkins School District, I think, is experiencing some growth in enrollment, and there's some positive signs there. But that just really leaves me with questions that I don't have answers for. You know, how do we provide more opportunities for people of color to be homeowners? How do we change the negative perception of renters and affordable housing in general? And how do we move from a position of scarcity and protection to one of equity? Like I said, I don't have these answers. I think Hopkins residents are fairly open-minded. I think equity is a value they would say they share, but yet we continue to run up against the same arguments when we introduce opportunities for affordable housing. And to, I think, actually bring Black homeownership rates up to where they should be, that takes money. I think it takes resources, and it takes policy changes. And I don't believe those solutions are easily found at a city level. I do think that this is an area where state and federal movement needs to be made. But certainly we need to be at the table, and there are things that we can do on the ground. And it's where we see the impact most is at that local level. So I'm anxious to get into the conversation, hear people's thoughts about what we can do, and I will stop there.
Okay. Kirsten, thank you. Very, very informative. There is a question. There's several questions. Some are coming in the chat room, and some are coming through a different channel. And maybe this seems natural for you, and that is, let's see here. It seemed to have moved. Just had it, and okay, let's see here. Let me get back to it. Another question moved. I don't know how it moved on me, but it had to do with what can city planners do to help mitigate this? Okay, what tools do city planners have to mitigate this historical practice and prevent gentrification, which seems to be the silent market-driven covenant of today? Any thoughts on that? You know, as a city planner, what practices, what tools do you have available to you to address these issues?
Well, certainly land use is really dictated by zoning, and so zoning is a big part of the conversation. The right of cities to exclusively zone, create neighborhoods where only single family homes are allowed is something that has been legal since a court determination back in the 20s. And so there's nothing illegal about exclusionary zoning. And so again, I think a conversation on a much higher level about the appropriateness and use of zoning is probably something that would be helpful to have. Tools, you know, I think in everything that I've read, there's still a lot of just underlying discrimination and racism going on in home buying. I think that, you know, people will be steered into neighborhoods based on their color. Certainly, there have been documented cases of people of color being targeted for higher interest loans and kind of predatory lending practices. Those don't necessarily come into play in my role as a city planner, but certainly education is, I think, a role that we can play.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's a question, and I'm going to call on Dr. Delegard because this is it's one that it's right in the research that you've been doing, and most of us, I wouldn't say all, but many people are aware that Wells Fargo in particular, along with other banks, have been slapped pretty hard within the last 3 to 4 years on redlining and predatory lending, as you mentioned, Kirsten. The question here is, how do covenants play into mortgages and lending practices today? And Dr. Delegard, if you, does that kind of fit in your wheelhouse?
Well, I mean, I can say that covenants are illegal today.
Yeah, well, that's true, but
Yeah, they've been illegal since across the country since 1968. You know, historically, to get the best mortgage rate, to get the best terms for a loan, you had to have a covenant on a house. You know, so historically, they have shaped the affordability of housing. Today, a house that has a covenant on it across Hennepin County is worth 15% more than the identical house that doesn't have a covenant. That is a hard number that we have come up with working with a team of economists. So, you know, so again, I think there's been a lot of things that have come into play since covenants were made illegal that still serve as structural barriers. So to Kirsten's point about zoning, I think one thing that people think about zoning as sort of this ahistorical thing that we've always had zoning, but in fact, land use policies are very much dependent on covenants. So in Minneapolis in particular, we know that there was not citywide single family zoning until covenants were made illegal. So in other words, it was like once one of these barriers came down, another barrier came up. And I think that probably lending practices and real estate practices have changed in that same way since covenants were made illegal, if that makes sense. That unfortunately new barriers do seem to develop that have the same effect, which is locking into place these demographic patterns that were established by covenants.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. I don't know if this question is for you or, but I'm going to toss it out there. And the question is gentrification a current result of the redlining in the past? Any thoughts on that, or do you need to pass that on to Daniel or the other Kirsten?
I'll take a quick pass at it, but then I definitely want help from which is, I mean, I think it's important to think about gentrification as just the latest phenomenon. That gentrification, I mean, this is everything that we're talking about here is basically white people reserving the land where they want to live for themselves and pushing out other people. So it's like when the first ring suburbs or, you know, the Lakes districts of Minneapolis are the most desirable places, that's where the covenants are. But now that things have shifted, the way people see urban space, they want to be closer into the city. They want the amenities. They're able to move back. People with capital, white people with capital, are moving back into neighborhoods like the Old South Side and displacing people who've lived there for generations. And it's all part of the same phenomenon of who gets to control the land, who gets access to property, who gets access to capital so that they can hang on to land and have stable, affordable housing. But I would appreciate some help from my very smart on this one.
I would just add that, you know, for gentrification to happen, the land has to be affordable for it to be purchased and redeveloped. And so when you have areas that values have been depressed, that's a candidate for gentrification because you can buy that property and redevelop it, and financially that pencils out. It's really hard to buy property that has a high value and see that same gentrification realized without, you know, subsidies and additional funds coming into the project.
Yeah, I would just add that, Kirsten, once again, well, both of you are brilliant, but Kirsten Delegard, that's powerful. This idea that, because we are rightly focused on gentrification now, but thinking of it as part of this continuum that goes back to Dakota land being something that white settlers laid their hands on and said, this is now ours. So that idea of from, you know, dispossession of indigenous people through restrictive covenants and then the red lines and all that followed that, and now and throughout that, seeing tools like gentrification, zoning, I think that's really important for folks to see it all as a continuum. That's powerful.
Okay, there was a question in here, and it's kind of gone away, but I remember it. And this is something that's happening, and it's not just here in the Twin Cities. I see it when I've gone to like the DC, Maryland area. You've got the metro, and it slices and dices into different communities. If you go to Atlanta, the I forgot the name of their rail system, but similarly, they had a lot of questions about where the light rail would go into, and so the question is, in today's environment, does the light rail, the development of light rail, does it hurt or help African American communities?
You know, I'll take this one, and certainly the others can weigh in. I would say it probably does both. We have the line that goes through Hopkins is considered a jobs line. There are multitude of employment opportunities in the western suburbs, and there are people that need jobs in Minneapolis, and the line should be able to affordably connect those people that need work with jobs. And so we have viewed it as a way to bring some equity into our region by making those connections. The bad or the flip or the other side of that, depending on how you're looking at it, is light rail also brings increase in property values, and increase in property values fuels gentrification. So, we're trying to figure out how to maximize the benefits to our community through the light rail investment without displacing people that have found Hopkins to be their home. And so that's difficult. I don't know that there's an example in the country that we can point to and say, this is how you do it. So it is something that we continually try to challenge ourselves about thinking how to do it better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell that the information that's been shared this evening, I don't remember seeing this many questions coming into the chat box and such. So this is really great. I mean, I'm really pleased to see that the people participating this evening are paying this much of attention and really coming up with some solid questions. I had one right here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, here's a question, and I'm not sure exactly who this should go to. But I'm going to just put it out there. And that is this: can the speaker expand on the factors that have maintained the racial segregation in the Twin Cities despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968?
I think we can all, this is a long topic, right? And I think we all can weigh in on this to some degree. I mean, I think it's important, first of all, to recognize that the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. The Minnesota Fair Housing Act was passed in 1962. And that simply lowered these certain legal discriminatory barriers. Certainly the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, never really had much enforcement power. I mean, it was never enforced in the way that advocates imagined it to be. So that's one thing. That you have a law in the books, but it doesn't matter if it's not really enforced. The second thing is that it's not, when you have decades and decades of damage, intergenerational trauma, intergenerational wealth disparities, when you have, a city where a metro area where the whole built environment is remade according to race, and where some areas are highly resourced and some areas are, choked off. You cannot just make everything equal by just lowering the barriers and saying, okay, everyone go forward. You have to have some kind of reparative work that's done. And that's what we have never done as a country collectively. We've never done the reparative work. And that's what we're trying to, one of the things that we are trying to advocate for with Mapping Prejudice is the need, the demonstration of these deliberate policies of creating these inequities, and hopefully building some political will to convince people that, the moral urgency of all, that we all have to work actively to repair the damage that was done. So.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Okay. One of the things I was reflecting back on the video, and I mean, it's something that's fairly well known. I mean, it's home ownership has been kind of a cornerstone value in America. And it's not just home ownership, it drives wealth, it drives. And so, when you look at the mix of disparities in Minnesota and all across the country, in Minnesota in particular, it's not just one aspect. Housing is an area, but education is another area. Employment is another area. Criminal justice is another area. Healthcare is another area. So these things all have intersectionality to them. But it seems like, when you really look at it from the standpoint, people have to have a place to live, basically. So it really seems to start there. And then there's so much triggered from home ownership that could address some of the disparities that we have. I'm not going to say it's not a solution, but it certainly seems as though it would be one place to get started. But I'm just throwing it out there. That's not really a question. It's kind of a reflection. And I don't know if anybody has anything to comment on that. But when you really think back about what are the messages in the video, it is about housing and these covenants and such, but it's a much, much bigger picture than that. I know that the state has attempted to address disparities. They created an officer level position, an office of inclusion, some time ago under the Dayton administration, I believe, and then that was carried forward under Governor Walsh. But yet and still, and then we've had something like the Itasca Project. The Itasca Project's been going on for what now, 20 years. And yet and still, I'm not going to say that it hasn't produced anything, but I would say that during the time of all these great investigative studies and all this analysis, and it's kind of like paralysis by analysis, the conditions around disparities has actually gotten worse. So it makes me wonder, where are we going with this whole thing? So let me just get back to our topic for tonight. So that was just kind of my little side comment. Anyway, Daniel,
really,
yeah,
it's a totally appropriate comment. And I was thinking about the Itasca Project. I actually did a series with that group of business and civic leaders over a decade ago. And
Daniel, could I stop you just a second? Yeah. Could you explain to the audience what the Itasca Project is all about and how it got started? If you have that information, I think you probably know.
Yeah, the little I know is that it really was kind of a business-led initiative to say, if we want to be a competitive region, we've got to think about our region holistically. So there was kind of an enlightened self-interest, is that these were business leaders, but they're smart people and they know that, if we're all doing better, that their bottom line will as well, and will be a vibrant and robust region. And some of the leaders were and are really important in our community, like Mary Brainerd, who I think really epitomized that work as a nurse and then a leader, just a medical leader. But so we did this project that was a series of documentaries that looked at the race, place, and class disparities as they were emerging in that study, the Mind the Gap study. And it's interesting you bring this up, because it was an idea of not appealing to the heart, but the mind, like this idea of, this is good business to make sure that, those people in the urban core, that youth of color, that they're doing well. That's going to be better for us as a population over the decades. Part of our storytelling was to try and appeal to the heart and to, that idea that it is still the right thing. And it's, so to your point of like, what happened, that is frustrating. And as someone who was immersed in that storytelling and hopeful to look back and see that the disparities have gotten worse, that it is something for us to really stop and think about. These were really smart people doing important work. They still are. But what's up with that? That it's
right. Well, it's interesting. I'm looking at a showstopper question. I mean, all the other questions, they're great questions and they're all directed at certain things, but here's something that one of the people in the audience just sent in. And the question is, in this moment, what is giving our panelists hope? So Daniel, you're up. So I think you can, okay,
well,
go ahead. And we can talk about action items. What gives us hope, and what are some of the actions that we can actually take, as citizens, and activists? So how can we engage in this conversation into action?
And that's a big part of it, is that every individual, Kirsten talks about these inflection points when we saw the Minnesota paradox tension of, can we transcend the racism that's inherent in the state, and we move the needle a little bit. So that idea of individual and collective action, I have to say, having a urban planner really taking in these kinds of narratives, really listening to community, to all sides of the community, and then sharing that out. And then, policy and planning emerging from that. That's huge. I mean, I know, Kirsten, that Kirsten with an E, that was one of your hopes, and you and the team was, starting to get the ears of urban planners. That was I know you all were very excited when that started to take hold. So that's real. It's not as sexy as, the protests in my neighborhood when my daughters and I were out there, and that's powerful. And we need to do that too. But the idea of, in these city halls and in these seats of government, of people who see these disparities, have the ability to kind of create policy to make change and repair, that gives me hope. This gives me hope talking with you all. And that's a big part of it, Kirsten, is that you're really kind of approaching this from that city hall perspective. And so that helps.
Yeah, I would add the fact that we're able to talk about it in this way, in a very open and honest way, I think it gives me hope. I would say that it wasn't that long ago where this conversation couldn't happen. And so I'm optimistic that we are starting to be a little bit more honest about where we're at and where we need to be.
So yeah, to jump on the bandwagon, but yeah, we have had now as a project, my team, I think we have done something like 240 presentations with community organizations, and I have not invited myself to any of these. I have been invited to these conversations. So that says to me that there are thousands and thousands of people who see that the moral urgency of this moment that we're in. We have more than 5,000 volunteers now who volunteer to help us build this map to really confront this history. And yes, like you say, paralysis by analysis, right? And that's the pushback that we get sometimes with mapping prejudice. Like, okay, we know this, right? This is not a secret, but I do think that people have to, as Daniel said, marry the heart and the mind. That's where the action comes forward, and have that empathetic connection. And that's, where the storytelling of Jim Crow of the North comes in, that people have to feel, that empathetic connection. But yes, that's where I draw the hope. It's all of you. It's the fact that you're sitting in, despite the crazy situation that we're in, that we're all on Zoom tonight in the middle of a pandemic, you all are turning out because you know that this is critical to our future. And, and I have a sign behind me that says vote. That's what's the only thing that has ever made a difference is people mobilizing in this kind of organizing space that you have created and getting together and making things different. So it's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be one election. It's not going to be one policy. This is a marathon, but I feel so lucky to live in this community.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, this is a big question. What is the call to action? I mean, in the areas of the work that I do, it's always the central question: what's the call to action? And the challenge is, if I may, is it's kind of like you've got to be careful. I mean, there's two scenarios. There's one scenario is ready, fire, aim, and the other one is ready, aim, fire. And the reason I say that is without the research, without the information, oftentimes solutions can be short-lived if they're not properly developed and put together. But again, I'm an advocate for getting the research. Information is knowledge, knowledge is power. We know that. And that's one of the things that the Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative has been all about from the very beginning. It's not trying to solve racism. It's trying to address the effects of racism through awareness and understanding. I mean, it's kind of like solving world hunger. That's good luck with that. That's not to be dismissive or anything. It's just that these are big issues. And for any of us that are engaging in this community conversation this evening, part of the answer is with us. We all have to act individually, and I believe we have to act collectively. That's where some of the breakdown starts to occur. At an individual level, and if I don't know you, and if I don't have a relationship with you in some way or shape or form, it's hard for me to do a collective action step with you because I just don't know you. And I think that's where we are right now. The country is sadly very divided. I mean, the feeling in this country today is not anything that I've experienced, even during the civil rights era. And that was tumultuous. It was crazy. It was a lot of violence, but it was something. It just didn't feel as divided. The rhetoric was pretty crazy, but right now it's just not. It's not good, and it doesn't feel like it's going in the right direction. But anyway, there are still lots and lots of questions here. I just don't believe that we have the time to answer everything this evening. I'm going to really just thank all the folks that stuck with us throughout the evening. I think when I first looked, we were peaked out a little above 90 folks that were that dialed in this evening, which in Minnesota on a beautiful night like tonight, as Dr. Delegard said, perhaps one of the last nights before the season shifts on us. So I think that's a pretty good number. And it doesn't take an entire country to move a rock, so to speak. I mean, if we get folks together, we can make things happen, and policies and procedures come from people who vote. So your sign behind you, Dr. Delegard, is most appropriate. So with that, I'm actually going to think about starting to close this out for the evening. I want to thank Daniel in particular for his tremendous work on putting together a significant video. And I know you collaborated with Dr. Delegard, and that's good. She gets the props too. And then Kirsten with the E, our Kirsten there in Hopkins. Thank you for your input and going through the kind of the information sharing around Hopkins. And again, it's not just around Hopkins. There's redlining everywhere. This is a U.S. phenomenon. And so I think tonight's been a good night. It's been a rich night for information sharing. Now, some of you may want to know what's coming next. And I would like to think that, well, go to the Hopkins website, as I mentioned before, and give us some input. We need your input. We don't just sit around having conversations about what do we think that's needed. We really try to base it on the expressed needs of the community of folks that engage with us. So with that, I think we've covered pretty much everything, but I will, before we shut down, I'm going to just offer to each of the panelists, if you have like a closing comment or just a nugget of hope or a solution or something before we go, I'm just going to turn it over to each of you and just make it brief, but make it substantial, if you can do that.
I'll go first. This is Kirsten. I just want to say that even though we have a lot of challenging issues that come up in Hopkins, we have a council that's really committed to equity, and I think that our track record recently of approving some pretty controversial affordable housing developments speaks to that. We with our last 3 projects that we approved, about 34% of the housing units will be affordable, and so I'm optimistic that we have good intentions behind our actions, and that we can certainly work from that to continue to try to build the Hopkins where everybody has a chance to live and contribute, and to continue to be the incredibly vibrant and really see the diversity that we have as the asset that I think most people do.
Okay, well, good. Well, continue your work with the race initiative there in Hopkins, and thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, just what I like about this conversation is this idea of us as a region. so often, and even in my film, we think about these maps and borders and boundaries. And I really think we need to think about solutions to structural racism and systemic racism, and also our individual place in that heart and mind change as a region and as a state. And I think, that's what I like about this conversation today, is kind of how we're connected, our fates are connected, and we need to kind of think beyond our municipal boundaries. So it's been good talking with you all, and thank you.
Again, and thank you for your work, and continue. Keep it going. I know you've got some things under wraps. You didn't even mention it, but maybe the next time you'll give us a clue what's coming. Okay? Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Delegard.
I can give you a quick preview. Daniel has a new documentary coming out next week called Citizen, about the long struggle for the vote. I personally am super excited about that. I guess I'll leave on a high note. Bill, you were saying that you feel like this feels like it's something you've never experienced before. I hope it's the birth pains of a new era. That's what's sustaining me right now, and the fact that that we can come together, and a planner, a filmmaker, a historian, Bill, I think of you as a connector, that we all be here talking about what we need to do, and just be so serious and united. I think that it's all clear what the work that we have ahead of us. So thank you all.
We have work to do, that's for sure. And trust me, it's been absolutely my pleasure working with you, Dr. Delegard. This is like about a third or fourth time doing something like this. Daniel, you and I have done this a couple times, and a different forum tonight. And Kirsten, the other Kirsten, I have the pleasure of meeting with her on a monthly basis throughout the year with the Hopkins Race and Equity Initiative. So this is kind of my posse right here. So I'm happy to have such informed people. You make me look good because you've got all the answers. You've got the information. So thank you again for your commitment of time and all the work that you do. And I just ask that you continue to keep on with it. And for those of you who joined us this evening, thank you. Spread the word. And I did mention that we'll be doing something again. You can probably find out on the Hopkins website, but this is like late September. I suspect it'll probably be maybe early into the new year before we have another heavyweight program put together. But we're at it, and if we get a lot of input, we base this on demand also. Now that we're in a virtual environment, it's a little different in constructing a program like this than if we have to get space and have people come, what have you. So while we're still in a virtual environment, who knows, maybe we'll come up with another great program here in the near future. So again, I'd like to thank everybody again for being here. And I'm going to, at this point, sign off and wish everyone well. Have a great evening. Thank you.